Hello, and welcome to today's program. This is Your Health Matters. I'm your host, Dr. Peter Hogenkamp, and today we're going to be discussing intermittent fasting on the program. I've asked my friend and colleague, Dr. Mike Kenosh, to help me out with this. So Mike, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Peter. Thanks for having me.
So I wanted to frame today's discussion by saying that I am the father of 4 millennial children. And as a consequence of that, I have had drummed into my head, perhaps beaten is the better word, beaten into my head the idea that the old ways of doing things are not necessarily the best ways of doing things. In fact, sometimes they can actually be not good ways of doing things. As a case in point, I refer you back to one of the discussions we had several months ago about the food pyramid, which was released by the USDA in 1992. As many of us know, I think we're all familiar with the food pyramid. This recommended that each American have 6 to 11 servings of grains, rice, bread, and cereals every day. And I think Dr. Kenosh and I would agree that this is not only not correct, but pretty much the opposite of what you should be doing. But the idea is that this is information that is not only incorrect, but probably detrimental to your health. I could point to you to a number of studies talking about the weight of Americans and the health of Americans during that time period. But I will tell you that by even the most conservative study, Americans have gained 10 pounds since 1992. So, and we can't blame the food pyramid for all of that, but I certainly think it doesn't help when we're passing out kind of information that is possibly detrimental to our health. Moving that back to our discussion today, I can hear my mother telling me as I walk out the door, Peter, you can't leave the house until you eat breakfast. Breakfast is the most important meal of the day. This whole idea of 3 square meals is good for us. And Mike and I were just kind of talking before the show, and we were saying, who said 3 square meals is good for you? And on what evidence did they base that? So let's get back to our topic today, and that's intermittent fasting. And I want to just talk to Mike about, first defining what intermittent fasting is and telling us how you would do it.
Okay. Well, again, thanks for having me. I'll preface this by saying I'm not an expert on this, right. As there are really some interesting studies, a lot of them in yeast, mice, and we're now starting to see stuff, I think, in human studies, which
human studies
is really trying to, again, answer this question of what do we know and what don't we know. But intermittent fasting is probably a general term that could encompass a number of different types of caloric restriction, so restricting your calories. Probably the first thing I want to throw out there is the misnomer that calories in is calories out. So I think the quality of food that you eat, the timing of when you eat, all play into our own metabolism and genetics and how we fight inflammation and how we do other things. So it's incredibly complex, and I think I certainly don't know all the answers. I think we're just starting to peek into that stuff.
Right.
But I think we've seen some really promising evidence to show how helpful it can be along a broad spectrum of our health.
Right. Not just weight loss.
Not just weight loss.
Right.
Cardiovascular disease, blood pressure. I think really the insulin, the whole insulin axis and how our insulin works in our body, and whether we're moving towards diabetes or not moving towards diabetes. Right. I mean, I'm sure you're as aghast as I am when we hear that 50% of the U.S. population in another 10 or 15 years is going to be diabetic or pre-diabetic. Yeah. These things and the obesity rate and these things really, we can't link them to one. It is, however, a
good job for job security for me, Mike.
Yeah, right. But it is, it's difficult because when we see these misconceptions like the food pyramid and other things, and we really boil down the information to what we do know, it changes what we thought we knew.
Right. So kind of sticking with what evidence suggests is a great idea.
Right. And it's always changing too. In medicine, the things that we thought were right, We could go into many examples of that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I would say that my personal experience with fasting, I remember being at a conference, I don't know, probably 12 years ago. It was actually a wilderness medicine conference.
Nice.
Which they have some of the most interesting lectures I've ever seen. But a particular presenter whose topic was something like, how do you start a fire anywhere, anytime, had mentioned during the lecture that he fasted. And I remember somebody asked him, well, what are you talking about? What are you doing? And he kind of off the cuff talked about the health benefits of it. And it always kind of stuck in my mind like, I should probably look into that a little bit more.
Right.
But I didn't.
Right.
Until years later, you made me get a colonoscopy, which was a very good idea for my health.
Right.
And I was actually under the impression at the time, I had thought I had switched eating to, healthier habits, small frequent meals, different foods that I ate. I was dreading the colonoscopy, not because of the procedure so much, but not eating.
Not eating, right.
Because I was used to eating, every 2.5 to 3 hours.
Because it's like a 3-day program where you have to prep for the colonoscopy.
Right, right. And so what really surprised me was during that time that I wasn't able to eat 24 hours before the colonoscopy, I felt awesome. I really felt good.
Right.
And I thought, and it kind of, I
Went
think,
back to what that guy was telling you.
brought that memory back
Yeah,
up. Yeah. So I started doing it probably about 2.5 years ago in my own way. I will say I really didn't know what I was doing. Not that I know what I'm doing now.
Right.
But looking into some of the new trends, I would say that it's changed a little bit of how I do things. Usually people talk about intermittent fasting.
It's like a 16 to 8 type thing?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So linking it to your circadian rhythm
Right.
and your body's clock and how that affects your metabolism, your genetics, your hormones, all that stuff seems to be very powerful. But there are other categories too. Some of those are prolonged fasting where you're not, in a strict sense, eating anything, just water, maybe coffee, tea, kind of no additives for multiple days.
Right.
So not to get too off on that tangent, but there's also a fasting mimicking diet where you can eat low calories, certain foods over a 5-day period of time. And for somebody who's otherwise healthy, they're showing evidence, of improvement in a lot of metabolic markers, disease states, inflammation. But this being generally better tolerated than actually just doing like a water-only fast for 5 days.
Right.
There are some people that get to that point. I mean, I like to think of it as, I'm doing a couple 5Ks and these people are running ultra marathons who are doing the 5-day fasts, just water only. But I think looking at prolonged fast, looking at intermittent fasting, and then there is some basic science, again, more animal models, not a lot of human models, in just caloric restriction and reducing your calories just every day.
Right.
And how that changes metabolism. But that's pretty difficult to do for a lot of people long term.
So let's say a viewer's watching this program and he or she just says, I want to try this. Mm-hmm. So how would they try it? What's the easiest way to get started?
I think intermittent fasting is a great way to get into it.
Right.
So when we, I should probably use the term time-restricted eating is what
time-restricted eating.
Yeah, time-restricted eating. So looking at establishing that circadian rhythm with food or reestablishing that circadian rhythm with food and the health benefits, because your body responds to the time that you eat, obviously different hormones, chemicals, all those
So you were
types
saying
of
calories in, calories out. That's actually too simple. It's actually also when you eat those calories.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's when you eat, it's what you eat, it's how, it's a whole bunch
the whole
of different,
thing. Yeah.
It's not as easy a math equation as we know.
So to make it simple, let's say I wanted to try it.
Yeah.
Eat between noon and 6? Is that too simple?
That's great. I mean, I would actually start with a 12-hour eating window and a 12-hour not eating window. So the earlier in the day you can do it, the better.
Okay.
So, 8 to 8, well, you're getting into later hours where your body's not so primed with insulin and with biochemistry and other things. So if you can make it 6 to 6,
right,
and if that fits in your schedule, beautiful. Start that, see how it goes. It's very flexible. You don't have to do it every day. You can do it every day if you want. And again, that kind of gets you introduced into it and get your body used to it. And then as you expand the non-feeding window and shorten the feeding window,
right,
the health benefits seem to be better.
Right. So start off 12-12.
You start off 12-12.
Narrow it down.
Yeah. Go to 16-8.
Right.
Go to 6-18.
And there's also this 5-2 intermittent or where you basically 2 days a week you have almost very few calories.
Right.
500 or less.
Right.
Yeah.
And another. Again, we don't know what the dose, what the best way to do it for the maximum health benefits is. But what's interesting is all these different varieties of it, there seem to be consistently good results in terms of metabolic syndrome. And I think some of it depends too on how is your general health. Is your general health pretty good? Or if you're diabetic, if metabolic syndrome, if you're obese, then there are things that we want to go a little bit slower and go into that. Kind of if you were counseling somebody in an exercise program, hey, don't go out and run a half marathon if you haven't been exercising.
Right.
Gradually get into that and move into that.
So then the next question is, why do time-restricted eating? Why do it? And we were kind of alluding earlier that there's a tremendous number of health benefits for this.
Right.
And one of the things I've said in previous programs is, we are all motivated by various things. My patients seem to be motivated by looking better and feeling better, as opposed to improving their metabolic parameters.
Right.
But that fits in here because people feel better.
You're not waking up looking at your cholesterol every morning.
No, you're not. But you're waking up thinking, geez, I look okay, or how do I feel?
Yeah.
And people who do time-restricted eating do feel better.
Yes. And I think they're, mental clarity, energy level,
right,
and just a general feeling of, hey, your metabolism is more efficient. I think you can pick up on that.
Right.
Yeah.
So I guess probably the first thing people would be looking to do would be weight loss.
Sure.
And are there studies that show weight loss?
Again, I couldn't kind of refer you to the individual studies, but absolutely.
Right.
Weight loss, actually increase in lean muscle mass.
Right.
And if you're working out, even just one strength training a week, people kind of on an intermittent fasting or time-restricted eating appear to be gaining more lean muscle mass from their working out. So benefits with exercise as well. There are some thoughts on aerobic capacity as well. So there are some benefits with that, but definitely weight loss, and actually that visceral fat loss, the mobilization of that visceral fat, which as is really important for chronic disease and our longevity and living longer.
Right.
So there's some really exciting stuff about that. I think we kind of look at fasting, and it depends on the type of fasting, as getting a way to tap into that mobilizing ketones.
Right.
So how do we mobilize the fat that we've already stored? And this seems to be a really nice way to do that. Again, there's ways that do it more than others, but this does seem to be one of its benefits. So
the basic idea, not to get too heavy into the biochemistry because I've been trying to forget the biochemistry for a long time, but basically if you're not eating any calories, then your body is going to use up the calories that are stored in your liver, in the form of glycogen, which is a form of glucose. And once that's done, you start burning fat.
It's going to look for ketogenesis. It's going to look for ketones to use.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So if you're not getting glucose, absolutely, that's what it's going to try and do.
Right. And it just makes sense from a kind of common sense standpoint. If you're constantly eating your food, you're fueling your body at all times. You don't need to reach into the tank at all.
Right. And even if I think if your calories are low, but even if you're eating the wrong things, then that's going to be a headwinds against you too.
Absolutely.
So if you're spiking your insulin and you're doing things, you're spiking insulin, it's going to store it as fat.
Absolutely.
Yep.
And people talk about insulin. I think most Americans realize that diabetics, or at least the type 1 diabetics, don't have insulin, and that's a problem. But from our standpoint, it turns out that too much insulin is usually more of a problem than too little insulin for most Americans.
Yeah.
Insulin is a growth hormone. It causes us to put weight on. In fact, it does a lot of bad things.
Right.
And we don't want our insulin levels to spike.
Right.
So you mentioned longevity. I mean, all of us would like to lead long, healthy lives.
We think so. Oh yeah. The fact that you said healthy, right?
Healthy. So how does, is there evidence to suggest that people who do time-restricted eating actually live longer?
We're moving in that direction.
Right.
The evidence seems to be mounting. So again, we want to be careful. We don't know everything at this point.
Right.
But certainly, single level studies, yeast, mice,
rats as well,
monkeys, worms, all kinds of things that they're looking into, and now looking really with some super exciting stuff coming with how it affects our genetics, our genome, how do we repair gene dysfunction. One of the things.
Wow, that's pretty cool stuff there.
Well, some of the evidence is starting to point towards this will allow a cell to basically repair itself, clean itself up, not die. So not apoptosis where it just says, I'm done.
Right. See you later.
Kind of the executioner.
Yeah.
But they talk about it more as a first responder, so autophagy. So we're going to come up, we're going to clean everything up, we're going to get rid of the stuff that's not working well anymore. And actually some people are thinking that this stress to the body, being a positive stress, making these changes happen, we're starting to tap into, are we able to turn some cells more into that progenitor stem cell? We talk about regenerative medicine where we're pulling stuff out of people's bones and injecting it in different places. This seems to be kind of our own inherent mechanism maybe for doing this. So people are looking at studies in cancer, people are looking at studies obviously in autoimmune disease, but absolutely being able to not necessarily reverse the effects of aging. There are people that are starting to look into that, kind of crazy, but slowing down your clock, absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
I was in some of the research I was doing to prepare for today's episode, I saw that there's quite a bit of looking into the effects of intermittent fasting on cancer.
Yeah.
Not only preventing cancer, but also actually slowing down the effects of cancer once people actually have it.
Or even improving the actions of chemotherapy and other things.
Right.
It almost seems like, and again, these are totally preliminary studies, so people are starting to work on it in humans.
Right.
There's a guy at USC at the Center of Longevity, Walter Longo, that's starting to look at some of this stuff. But what they think might be happening is that stress, without having the food, actually causes the cell to go into protection mode. And so tumors don't respond to it like normal cells do. And if the cell is protected, the effects of the chemotherapy don't really work on the normal cells, work more on the tumor cells.
Yeah.
So it's really kind of a shift, and that's the philosophy or the theory in what they're trying to look at. But it is really incredibly exciting.
One of the things I saw when I was looking into this, which I thought was very interesting, was this idea that we've actually been doing intermittent fasting for a long time without realizing it, and that's the folks who participate with Ramadan, which is the Muslim folks that fast from Ramadan over an extended period of time. And in one study I saw, they actually looked at inflammatory markers over the period of Ramadan and saw that with all this fasting that folks were doing, that the decrease in the inflammatory markers was significant.
Yeah.
And as you and I know as physicians, inflammation is not doing you any good.
Right.
So there's a decrease in inflammation, the effects on blood pressure and cholesterol. Blood pressure goes down with intermittent fasting.
Yeah.
Cholesterol goes down. So those are great things. But again, one of the things I noticed was that there's a lot of people doing intermittent fasting strictly because it makes them sharper, it makes them feel better, and there is some evidence to suggest that you actually think better, more clearly when you're not eating.
Right. Yeah, I would totally agree. And again, we don't really know what the right method is.
Right.
My personal thought is that I think the benefits of it, it's flexible. Mm-hmm. You can do it however you want to do it.
Right.
And I think even though there's different
whatever
ways.
Fits into your lifestyle.
Whatever fits in to your lifestyle, whatever makes sense for your particular day or week, your schedule. The other thing I love about it is it's easy. I mean, so many things in life, it's like, Peter, you got to find 30 minutes a day to exercise.
Right.
You got to carve more time out for this.
Right.
The beauty about fasting is you don't have to do anything.
You don't have
You
to.
actually do less.
You do less.
So it's fantastic.
So this would be good for me because I'm inherently lazy.
Absolutely, yeah. But yeah, I think across the board, the different types of fasting do seem to show consistent benefit generally in our metabolism, our genetics, our weight, our markers for chronic disease and inflammation. So
Yeah.
pretty exciting.
Getting back to insulin, you think about how you feel, after a huge Thanksgiving meal. And, that's not the time you want to take a test. You're kind of logy.
Right.
What's happened is you've put a lot of calories into your body, especially sugar.
Yeah.
And so the body responds to that load of sugar by producing a load of insulin. And that's not great for mental clarity.
Right.
So give me a few practical tips, for the viewer or listener or those tuning into the podcast who want to try starting this. What are some, you mentioned already, trying a 6-hour window.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any other kind of practical tips that you might have?
Well, I think, do what makes sense. Do what makes sense for your schedule. Do what makes sense for your own medical issues.
Right.
So, if you're generally healthy, sure. If you're diabetic, if you're on lots of medicines, I think certainly talk to your physician about it.
Because especially if you're a diabetic.
Now, they may not know much about it.
They may not.
Which is the other thing. We don't get a great education about nutrition in medical school.
Nope.
And then once you're out of medical school, you're kind of on your own anyway, right?
Like everything that I've learned about nutrition as a doctor has been post-medical school.
Right. Yeah. Right.
And a lot of it has been because I'm personally interested in it.
Yeah.
But you made a great point about the diabetes and talking to your physician. For instance, my patients who may want to try this, especially if you're on diabetic medications, you really have to talk this over with me.
Right.
Because some of these medications, you have to eat with them. And we may have to adjust your medication schedule,
Yep.
or it may not be actually something that works for you, especially if you're on exogenous insulin kind of thing.
Yeah. And I think also you want to be careful if you've had a history of eating disorder, if you've, those types of things.
That's a great point.
You obviously
Yeah.
want to be careful with that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Not that you can't do it, but certainly you want to make sure that I think you get the input of a physician.
So, you mentioned earlier there's kind of 3 ways to kind of approach calories. It's when to eat them, how many to eat, and the third thing would be what to eat.
Yeah.
And our focus today isn't necessarily on what to eat, kind of the diet idea, but are there things that make sense in terms of what to eat that go along with intermittent fasting?
Absolutely. Yep. Yeah. Again, this wasn't my model, but I was telling you about a longevity physician who's described basically the standard American diet as
Right.
dangerous.
Right.
He calls it a killing machine.
Right. So the standard American diet with the acronym SAD.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so basically eating whatever you want, whenever you want.
Isn't a great idea.
No.
Yeah.
Estimates are, I think he says maybe 10 to 20% of people who do that can actually maintain a decent health.
Right.
And so many of us, again, as we see these numbers of obesity, prediabetes, diabetes, actually, there was a study a couple of years ago, I think 2015, that showed for the first time since they've been charting data, they've seen that the death rate has spiked up for American males at a younger age.
Yeah.
So we're no longer able to say, hey, we're moving forward.
Right.
And
that's despite all the improvements, Mike, in medicine, in technology,
Right.
in science. Despite all those improvements, the death rate actually took a step back.
Right.
And that's basically because, us.
Yeah. So I think, his point is a lot of the data on what we're eating is wrong and how
Right.
we're eating.
Right.
So there are different levers that you can pull.
Right.
And they're not all mutually exclusive.
Nope.
So, if you're restricting the time that you eat, that certainly probably impacts your calories.
Right.
But I think the point would be if you're interested in improving your health, if you're interested in living longer, this is an incredibly easy, I don't want to say tool, but this is a great tool that doesn't cost you anything,
Right.
that's flexible, that you can grow with.
Mm-hmm.
If you're still shoveling the same old stuff into your mouth,
Right.
and it's not healthy if it's the standard American diet, you're probably helping yourself. You'll probably actually see some improvements. But if you also look at what you eat, and the quality of food that you eat, and getting away from the processed and chemicals and all that stuff. It's probably going to add more bang for your buck.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I tell my patients is, I'm constantly talking about real foods and a protein-based diet, and that protein diet and fats do something, they satiate you, which is something that carbohydrate doesn't do.
Yep.
So if you're going to be eating for, let's say, 8 hours a day and not for 16 hours a day, you probably want to put something into your system during those 8 hours that keeps you full.
Right.
And one of the things that carbohydrate doesn't do is it doesn't keep you full.
Right.
Carbohydrate, so there's no effect on the satiety center in your brain on carbohydrate, which means that if I eat a big bowl of pasta, I'm only going to stop eating when I am actually distended my stomach so much to the point where I can't eat anymore. Whereas if I'm eating a steak, the fat and protein in there tell my brain, okay, you've eaten, and so you don't need to eat anymore, kind of thing.
Yeah.
The other thing that big bowl of pasta or any kind of carbohydrate does is it spikes your insulin level. And as your insulin level spikes, your sugar level is going to drop down. And when that sugar level drops down, guess what? You're hungry.
Yeah.
And it's very, very hard actually to keep your fast going if that's going to happen to you. So I think combining a protein-based diet it seems like it kind of fits hand in hand there.
Yeah, I think so. There's a whole lot of different opinions on what the optimal diet is.
Right. There sure is. Yeah.
I kind of feel like I think it's better to look at general rules and not look at one diet being best for everybody.
Right.
And I think even if you try different things,
to work what best for you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And switch things up. You don't have to eat the same way for the rest of your life.
Right.
But I think what's interesting again. This particular physician who talks about, the different levers to pull, he'll also make points that any diet you're doing, moving away from the standard American diet, is a good thing to do.
Is a good thing.
So it's healthy. So even if you start in just simple steps, let's eliminate processed carbohydrates. Right. Great. There's people that are less inclined to think protein-based, but are we calling it low carb? Are we calling it ketogenic? Are we calling it paleo? They kind of overlap in a lot of areas.
In a lot of ways.
If you really look at what you're eating.
Yeah.
And I think if people will talk about whole foods, we talk about anti-inflammatory diet when we see patients because of the benefits of decreasing inflammation for pain, musculoskeletal conditions, and longevity. So there's really, I think, not one path. And that's what makes it confusing is when somebody Googles, what do I do?
Right.
Should I do the Mediterranean diet? Should I do this?
Right.
And they end up making these huge changes to their lifestyle, and they just can't stick with it.
Right.
So making small changes kind of on a path or a journey to getting healthy, I think makes a lot more sense.
Which kind of goes back to what you said about the intermittent fasting being so versatile.
It is.
And so easy to weave into your lifestyle.
Right. I think the other benefit too, and I didn't want to miss this point, we can come back to it later, is that
in the 1 minute we have,
is that you gain control over kind of some of those impulses that you used to have. So you talked about, in religion, spiritually. I mean, people have been doing this for thousands of years, right?
Yeah.
So what I've noticed in my own particular experience is that it was kind of difficult. I started with a 24-hour fast just because I didn't know any better, and so I picked a day of the week. I ate breakfast, didn't eat till the next breakfast.
Nice.
Just water, coffee, tea, whatever. I actually started with some broth and some other things just to kind of temper. But after a while, I didn't crave it. Right. I mean, I would come home and invariably my wife would make a huge dinner on Tuesday nights, and I'd walk in and smell all these things, and she'd be like, "You're not going to eat?" I'm like, "No, it's Tuesday. I'm fasting.
I don't eat on Tuesday.
Work with me." No, but after a while, I mean, I can even cook now, and make food in preparation for the rest of the week. And it doesn't bother me.
Because your body gets used to this.
Your body gets used to it. Your mind gets used to, hey, you've got control over this. It kind of flips the whole dynamic between food and meals controlling your day, and hey, I've got control of this. I use it like whenever I travel. I've traveled recently a little bit, and eating in an airport and being away from home and stuff is always really difficult to eat well when you're not, when you're on the road. Just like, I'm going to fast today. And it's simple.
Right.
And you feel good, you get work done, you do other stuff, and you don't have to worry about
Just wanted to thank Dr. Kenosh. That was a great discussion. As always, I love doing this program because I learn a lot. And I think there's a lot of stuff here for a future discussion.
Oh, absolutely.
So thanks again for coming.
You're welcome.
Thanks again for tuning in. Once again, make sure to hit the website, peter@peterhogenkamp.com, as well as Your Health Matters on YouTube and Buzzsprout. Cheers.